This conversation with your wife. So what do you want to eat? I don't care, you decide. How about Taco Bell? Oh, gross, that's not even Mexican food. I don't want that. Okay, well, how about pizza? No, I had pizza yesterday, no pizza. Okay, Chick-fil-A? Gross, no Chick-fil-A. If you want a burger or something like that, no, I'm not in the mood for a burger. Okay, so you do care. So why don't you tell me what you're in the mood for and we'll go there? No, I'm not really hungry. You just go somewhere that you want and I'll just eat a little bit of yours. You know, my guess is that conversation goes on in a lot of homes, right? Between a lot of couples. And if you know anything about that conversation, guys, you know that I don't care doesn't mean that, right? But you know, when we're talking about being hungry and wanting something to eat, what makes that conversation even more frustrating sometimes is because we just want something to eat, right? We're hungry. We don't want to debate. We just want to go somewhere and find something to eat. It seems like that's our conversation more often than not in the car when you've got 3 kids trying to decide where you're going to eat and what's best for everyone. It's hard to match up. It's hard to get on the same page. You ever seen the commercial for Snickers where they have a famous celebrity who is cranky or obnoxious or acting out in some way, and the friend offers them a Snickers and they said, why? Well, because you're being cranky, you're being obnoxious or whatever, and so they eat it, and when the camera pans back to them, they're a normal, average person, right? And the friend says, better? And they say, better. And the tagline at the end says, you're not you when you're hungry. I want to submit to you this morning that you are you when you're hungry. It may not be the best version of you, but it's still you. And what you eat makes all the difference in what you will become. And I also want to ask you this morning, what are you hungry for? There's a lot of different ways to answer that question, right? In fact, some research was done recently on a cross-section of Americans where they asked the question, what is your greatest ambition in life? And here's what the responses were. Being financially secure, starting my own company, having a family, owning a pet, traveling the world, owning my dream home, learning another language. Maybe some of those are on your list. Maybe you have a completely different list, but this is what many Americans said that they hunger for. These are their life ambitions. There are others in this country, in this world, who invest everything into things that are non-essential, but they think they're essential. You ever seen the show Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous? Some of you probably don't remember that, but that was hosted by Robin Leach, where it was an expose on the wealthiest people in our world. And it followed them around to look at all their cars and their big mansions and all the things that they had purchased with all the money that they had made. You ever seen the show Intervention? It's a documentary about people who have wasted their life investing in drugs or alcohol. You ever read the book of Ecclesiastes? It's the memoir of a man who lived the American dream before there was any such thing. A wise man by the name of Solomon, the wisest man on earth at the time, who did some really foolish things. He invested in so many things that were material, and at the end of it, he figured out it was all a chasing after the wind. In fact, most of you probably know Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13, which reads, the conclusion when all has been heard is, fear God and keep His commandments, because this applies to every person. In other words, Solomon's wisdom prevailed, and at the end he said, you know what? None of that stuff meant anything anyway. What really matters is the eternal, hungering for that above all else. I want to ask you this morning, what's your life's ambition? What do you hunger for? What gets you up in the morning? What is it that really gets you going and makes you have hope and motivates you to go through this life? And I understand, I don't want a church answer here. You know, we all have an answer, don't we? To these church questions, we all have a church answer. But that answer may not be what's right for you. It's the right answer, but it may not be what's right in your life. It's kind of like the Sunday school teacher that asked her little kids in class, she said, what is furry, climbs up and down trees, stores nuts for the winter, and has a bushy tail? Nobody answered. She said, come on, give me an answer. And finally little Johnny said, you know, I want to say squirrel, but I'm going to say Jesus. Because that's the answer we assume that the teacher wants, right? That's the church answer. The answer is always Jesus. So I know when I ask the question, what is your life's ambition or what do you hunger for? I know that you know the answer. But just because you know the right answer doesn't mean that you're living it. Just because it's the right answer doesn't mean it's the true answer for you. So as we go throughout this lesson, think about what it is that you hunger for. And you know, when I knew I was coming here to preach to you this morning, I thought about, do I do the standard Father's Day sermon since it's Father's Day? And I thought, well, you know, I'm going to be preaching to an audience that by and large I don't know. So I don't know that I want to do a Father's Day sermon and just limit myself to one segment of that audience. Plus, I don't know about you, but many of the Father's Day sermons I've heard are all about how the fathers need to step it up and how they're not doing a good enough job in leading. And then we get to Mother's Day sermons and it's all about how perfect mothers are and how great they are and all of that, right? And so I wanted to make sure that we didn't do the standard Father's Day sermon. And since I'm guest speaking this morning, let's talk about something that I think affects all of us. Because I think if we answer this question, what is it that you hunger for? It's going to affect mothers and fathers, and it's going to trickle down to our families, and it's going to make all of us better, as a family, as a church family even. Think about this. Think about being kidnapped and locked in a room. You're kidnapped and you're locked in a room. For the first few hours, what would you be thinking? What would be on your mind? For some of you, you would be thinking, what, no cell service? I mean, there's no internet? What are you talking about? Some of you might be thinking, there's no Xbox. Where's the TV, right? Think about being locked in that room for an extended period of time, maybe 5 days, 10 days. Now what are your thoughts? Now all of a sudden, you're not thinking about cell service. You're not thinking about, TV or Xbox. No, what you're thinking about now is, I've got to get out of here. I'm going to die if I stay in here. You've had no food. You've had no water. Now consider that somebody opened the door and let you out. You were free to go. What's the first thing you're going to do? Not go plug in your phone. The first thing you're going to do is go find food and water, right? Because you're desperate. You have to have it. You're going to say, point me in the direction of some food so that I can have sustenance. Point me in the direction of some water because my throat is so dry. It hurts. It's parched. My lips are cracked. I'm dehydrated. The first thing you're going to seek is food and water. Look at Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall see God. They shall be satisfied, it says. Everyone wants to be happy. And as a result, everyone is pursuing happiness. Have you noticed that? I mean, that's the great goal of this life, is just to be happy. And that's sad. Because happiness is such a shallow and cheap emotion. It's hollow. It doesn't deliver. Our culture understands this, which is why it markets happiness. Just turn on the TV, listen to the radio. Every ad is marketed toward your happiness. Whether it's blue jeans or teeth whitener, they're not selling blue jeans, they're not selling teeth whitener. What they're selling you on is happiness. If you have this product, you will be happy. If you just had this, you would be happy in life. And so there's newer, bigger, better, right? But newer, bigger, and better doesn't deliver. Because the very things that we pursue guarantee that we'll never be happy. I wish I had a newer, faster computer. But they come out with newer and faster computers all the time. I wish I had that new vehicle that had the backup camera and the heated seats and all that. But as soon as you drive it off the lot, it's obsolete just about, right? Even the clothes that we wear, they're fashionable at the time, but they go out of style. New things come in style. Newer, bigger, and better just doesn't deliver. The very things we pursue guarantee that we will never find happiness. And that's the interesting thing about happiness. That's the curious thing about it, is that the more you pursue it, the more elusive it seems to become. Think of someone suffering from a terrible disease. They've got all the symptoms: fatigue, nausea and vomiting, high fever, acute pain. And they go to the doctor. They go to the emergency room. The doctor treats them, gives them something for pain, starts them on a morphine drip, gives them something for the fever, to reduce the fever, gives them something for the nausea. And he walks away and says, well, my job's done. I mean, the person's not suffering anymore, right? So the doctor did his job, right? Well, not exactly. I mean, he committed a major problem or a major flaw in his diagnosis in that he only did what? He only treated the symptoms. He didn't get to the core of the problem. He didn't figure out what the real problem is, what was causing all of the symptoms. And that's what happens in our lives so many times. We focus on the surface stuff, and we never dig deeper to figure out what the real problem is. And one of the major problems is we're pursuing the wrong thing. We need to hunger for something more. We need to have an appetite for righteousness. Because as Jesus said, that's the only way that we will be satisfied. He says you will be blessed. And we often equate blessed with happy. But that's not the sense in which Jesus is talking about here. The Greek word for blessed is makarios, and it literally means large or lengthy. And the idea behind Jesus' use of this word is that when God blesses us, He extends to us all of the benefits that He offers. He enlarges mercy. He extends to us the length and breadth of His grace and His mercy and His forgiveness. A benevolent God has directed His love toward us, not to make us happy, but to make us blessed. I hear people say, well, God just wants me to be happy. No, He doesn't. He wants you to be right. He wants you to be holy. And if you are holy before God, if you're right before God, you experience something far greater than happiness. Happiness is a shallow, cheap emotion. You experience blessedness or joy. And you know what? Joy can be experienced in even the most difficult of circumstances. How could Paul sit in a Roman prison cell and say, rejoice in the Lord always? Again, I say rejoice, because he had something bigger than happiness. Happiness is tied to happenings. Joy is tied to something bigger, to where you're carried away to the point that life is no longer about you. It's about God. It's about serving Him. It's about hungering for something more. Think about the people that Jesus is speaking to here. I mean, consider context. It's something we talk about at Oldham Lane all the time when we study the Bible. Don't hunt and peck. Don't pluck verses out of context. Consider everything that's going on around this. And if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, think about the people that Jesus is speaking to. At the first part of it, it says that Jesus sat down and He began to teach them. When a rabbi sat down to teach, it meant something. It meant that He was about to give you the heart of His teaching. Jesus is about to give it all to them. He's about to lay it on them. He's about to expose to them the heart of God. And He goes through these Beatitudes. But think about the people that He is speaking to here. This is a ragtag group of people. They had no rights or no privileges. They were living in occupied territory. They were poor. I mean, most of the people there, if they were lucky, got to eat meat once a week. A working man's wage was 1 denarius. No one ever got fat on 1 denarius. When you look at John chapter 6 and you see that the people were following Jesus, they weren't following Him because they wanted more out of life. They didn't want Jesus to be their teacher and their master, and they weren't following Him because they wanted to be true disciples. They were following Him because they wanted their stomach filled again. Because remember when he had provided the miracle and filled their stomach with 5 loaves and 2 fish, that was something that was so incredibly rare in that day and time that they wanted it again. They wanted their bellies filled. Jesus wanted them to hunger for something more. And you see this ragtag group of people that Jesus is sitting down and talking to. They could be crucified. They could be killed by the Roman government with no reprisal. There were children in the audience that could be killed with no reprisal, no consequences. And it's to these people that Jesus looks at them and says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. It's interesting that Jesus would say something like this to these people. In our Western view of Scripture, we don't always understand the context like we should. We don't always dig deep enough to understand it. But the people in the audience this day would have understood perfectly what Jesus meant about hungering and thirsting. These people knew the Old Testament Scriptures. Many of them knew what was said in 2 Kings chapter 6, for instance. Now it came about after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, gathered all his army and went up and besieged Samaria. There was a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver and a fourth of a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. As the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried out to him, saying, "Help, my lord, O king." He said, "If the Lord does not help you, from where shall I help you? From the threshing floor or from the winepress?" And the king said to her, "What is the matter with you?" And she answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give your son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we boiled my son and ate him. And I said to her on the next day, 'Give your son that we may eat him.' But she has hidden her son." When the king heard the words of the woman, he tore his clothes. Now he was passing by on the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth beneath his body. As you read those words, what do you feel? I mean, disgust, desperation, right? I mean, they were selling not the quarters of the donkey where there was more meat, but the head where there was hardly any meat for $300 in our money. The stuff you find on the sidewalk, the excrement you see on the overhangs of businesses, they were selling for $19. People were eating dove's dung because they were starving. And in fact, some were even boiling their own children. How could you ever do that? We will never know what that's like. We will never be at the point of such a great famine that we know what it's like to turn to cannibalism or to eat dove's dung or to buy a donkey's head where there's very little meat for $300. But these people, they understood. They knew the stories from the Old Testament. They knew those stories. They had some idea about how bad it was. They understood what famine meant. This was not a genteel hunger that you just eat a Snickers and you feel better. The people were doing anything they could to find any kind of food or sustenance because they were going to die if they didn't get it. Or you picture a weary traveler traveling through the desert, and there is a strong wind that is blowing up the sand and it is swirling, and so they take the hood on their cloak and they pull it around their face and they walk backwards so they're not walking directly into the sand, and that sand is swirling and filling their nostrils, which is running down the back of their throat, causing them to have a sore throat, causing them to have to spit it out, causing them to have chapped lips. They could feel the grit of the sand between their teeth. You think about how thirsty a person would get after traveling a long distance through that kind of sandstorm and those kind of conditions. That's the thirst that Jesus is talking about. It's not like us when we go and work out in the yard and we go in and we can have a cold water, or we can turn on the tap and pour us some water. People living in this day and age didn't have that luxury. So when Jesus is talking about hungering and thirsting, it's a very different view of hungering and thirsting than we often have. Hunger and thirst are not passing feelings. They're not something that you just maybe have a mid-morning snack and you get over. Not for these people. That's not what these people were dealing with. They knew all about the discomfort that comes from hunger pangs and the excessive thirst. And it's something that continues in intensity until it is satisfied. And so the question becomes, do you hunger and thirst for righteousness? Is it something that you truly hunger and thirst for? Do you have an intense craving to be free from the bondage of sin? Is this something that is an appetite above all other things? That you hunger for this and you thirst for this above anything and everything else? You know, the word that is used for righteousness here is the word dikaiosune in the Greek, and it means integrity, virtue, purity. uprightness, correctness of thinking, feeling, and acting. It has to do with whatever has been appointed by God to be acknowledged and obeyed by man. And this word here, interestingly enough, appears in the accusative form. And when words appear in the accusative rather than the normal genitive form, it signifies the whole thing. Basically, that's what it means. So when you say, I hunger for bread in the accusative, it means I want the whole loaf. I want the whole thing. I thirst for something, like water. In the accusative, that means I want the whole pitcher. I want all you've got. I want all the bread you've got. I want all the water you've got. And so when Jesus is talking about hungering and thirsting for righteousness, you want the whole of righteousness, not just some. You want all of it, every single bit of it. And Jesus says, blessed are you if you're like that. Notice what's written in the book of Hosea, chapter 6 and verse 4. The prophet states, what shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? For your loyalty is like a morning cloud, and like the dew which goes away early. The context of this is that God's children had filled up on the earthly. They had filled up on the things that could not provide true sustenance. They needed soul food. Their existence was one long cycle of prosperity followed by rebellion, which led to begging for divine intervention. They did have a sustained hunger, but it was for the wrong things. Idolatry. Pursuing things that were material. Things that don't last in eternity. Their loyalty was like a morning cloud or like the dew that is here one moment and gone the next. It's the type of hunger that is satisfied for the moment but not long term. Like Snickers, right? The slogan for Snickers certainly is true. It does satisfy, but only for about 30 minutes to an hour, right? And then you're hungry again. It doesn't satisfy for the long term. And that's what these people were doing. They were pursuing things that don't satisfy in the long term, which is exactly what many Americans do as well. We pursue things that don't satisfy eternally. You ever seen a hearse with a luggage rack? Probably not. You can't take the stuff you're pursuing with you anyway. Which is why we have to pursue something deeper, something more substantial. Look at Peter and what he wrote in 2 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 20. He says, for if after they have escaped the defilements of the world by the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled in them and are overcome. The last state has become worse for them than the first. For it would be better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it, to turn away from the holy commandment handed on to them. It has happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to its own vomit, and a sow after washing returns to wallowing in the mire. Everyone pursues something. Everyone. Everybody. Don't think that worship only applies to religion, because it doesn't. Everyone worships something. Even the person who says, well, I don't have a master, nobody controls me. Yes, you do. Everybody does. Everyone bows down to something. The decision you've got to make is, like Joshua, are you going to serve God or are you going to serve one of these little g gods, right? Don't you find it interesting in Joshua chapter 24 that he gives a multiple choice invitation? I've never done that. But he said, hey, you've got a decision. You can choose door 1, 2, 3, whatever, but you've got to make a choice here. It's interesting that this leader, this legend of Joshua, is standing up there with all authority before these people, and he's not telling them what to do because you can't. You can't force this decision. You can't force love. You can't force God on anybody. It's got to be chosen. Love has to be chosen or it's not love. Joshua understood that. We all have to understand that. Are you going to serve these little g gods in your life, or are you going to serve the one true God, the big G God? That's the decision that we have to make. Are we going to hunger and thirst for all these things that don't matter? Peter's talking about how senseless it is for someone to put on Christ, for someone to follow Jesus, and then decide, okay, I'm done with that. I'm going to go back to living a worldly lifestyle. That's as silly as a dog returning to his vomit. Who would go and wallow back in the mud of this world after having Jesus? Who would do that? That's silly, right? But there are some that do. There are some that do. We buried that old sinful self in baptism, and then we return to it and we exhume that dead body and we put it on again and we go and live that old lifestyle. I don't know why, but we do it so often. And Peter says, it's silly. This is a sustained pursuit. You've probably figured out by now, those of you who are Christians, that the choice to follow God, the choice to follow Jesus and to serve Him is a choice you have to make every day. Every day. Yes, you make it one time, but then you continue to make it every day, right? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Okay, well, every day you're fighting competing gods. And God says, I don't want to compete. I should sit on the throne of your heart by myself. We all have a priority list probably, right? When I was coaching, I would say, faith, family, football. That just sounded so good. We all have a priority list probably. You have a priority list, and I'm sure it's one of those church answers, right? God, family, whatever. I want to suggest to you this morning to rearrange your priority list. Let's do a different priority list, and you can write this down if you want. Number 1, God. Number 2, there is no number 2. How about that? Just God. Because if you get God right, you get everything right. A right relationship with God affects every single thing in your life in a positive way. Your life won't be perfect, but it'll be certainly better. You get God right, it has a trickle-down effect. You become a better husband, a better wife, a better father, a better mother. All those things become better. So try telling your wife, guys, that you love her too much to make a God out of her. And wives, try telling your husband, I love you too much to make you the center of my life. Try telling your children that. Bring them in the room. Set them all down for your nightly devotional or your prayer and sit down with them and say, kids, we love you too much to worship you. As for me and my house, we're going to serve the big G God. And we're not going to let anything else get in the way of that. This is a sustained pursuit. And because it is a sustained pursuit, because it is a lifelong ambition, you will be blessed if you make it your goal. I'll close with this. Why is it that some animals that are supposed to be wild will eventually come up to you and eat out of your hand? You ever go to the park and ducks walk right up to you? Or you maybe go to a pond and you have some food there for the fish and they swim over to you. In Abilene, Texas, and West Texas, we have a lot of ranches. I can go out with some of my friends and we can drive the gator. You guys know what gators are, right? The little golf cart that's on steroids. And you can drive it out there and the cows will start coming to you and start following you, right? Why is that? Well, because they know you're going to feed them. You ever tried to get a little kitten that was wild, that was feral, to come and to eat out of your hand? That's a difficult thing to do, isn't it? So what do? You try to lure them out with food, and so you take some dry cat food and you throw it in their direction, and they come out and they look at you. They're very skittish. They eat with both eyes on you. If you make any sudden movement, they're gone, right? But over time, you start throwing out some more food. They start coming out and eating. They get a little bit more comfortable. They'll still get out of there pretty quick if you make any sudden movement, but you can start throwing the food a little closer to you. And maybe after a prolonged period of time, you can get them to come all the way up and eat out of your hand. And maybe even after a more lengthy amount of time, you can get them to eat out of your hand while you pet them. What happened over time to break down that barrier? Well, it's very simple. That little kitten wanted food above all else. And they were willing to risk their life to get food from you. To them, it was worth the gamble. Now, they were hesitant, they were reluctant, and of course, they're on high alert, but eventually they figure, I've got to have food, and therefore I'm going to do whatever and risk whatever in order to get it. And hopefully you see where I'm going with this. I don't believe that we as human beings have that in our nature to just simply to give up all these little g gods around us and to just gravitate towards God necessarily. There's a barrier there, and that barrier is sin. There's this chasm that exists between us and God. And what breaks that barrier down? Food. Soul food, right? The kind of food that only our Lord can provide. Living water. The spiritual diet that comes from His Word, that comes from pursuing Him by seeking Him with all of our might. Feasting on His Word, on fellowship with one another, coming and worshiping Him in spirit and in truth. All of those things, right? That feeds our soul. It's soul food. Many of you in this room have done that. You have spent your life pursuing God, and it's made all the difference, right? You're doing things for God that you never thought you'd be doing. And some of you here this morning may be pursuing something that is not satisfying you or is only satisfying you for the moment. And it's time to do something different. I can guarantee you this church is here to receive you, to love on you, to embrace you, to pray for you, to set up a Bible study with you, to immerse you in the waters of baptism for the remission of your sins. Don't leave here this morning without being right with God. Begin, if you haven't already, a daily pursuit of soul food this morning. All of you are born with an expiration date, and you don't know when it's going to come due. Don't play Russian roulette with your soul. If you need to respond this morning, do so. I think we're going to have a song. If you need to come forward, do so as we stand and as we sing.